You're hearing, listeners, what censorship is like in our country. Bush-Cheney warmongers like Paul Wolfowitz and John Bolton and others, and they have a record of false statements. They have a record of deception. They have a record of pursuing policies that are illegal under our Constitution, under international law. Now, a society that operates in a way where propaganda is not only emanating from the major media, but it gets into our schools, the kind of courses are taught, the content of the history, is a society that's not going to be mobilized for its own survival, much less the survival of other countries whose dictators we have for decades supported to oppress their people. We have empire here. We have both parties pursuing attacks, wars, subversions, drones, special forces, supporting, dividing, sectarian conflicts all over parts of Asia and Africa. And the question I want to ask you is, what do you think can start turning this around in terms of A, the citizenry, B, institutional turnarounds, maybe the Congress, C, electoral challenges from third parties or insurgent primary challenges like Bernie Sanders? If you had to describe a scenario of how we can turn around from empire, from imperialism, from colonialism, from the military-industrial complex having a vested interest in war rather than peace, what scenario would you urge on the public, or what scenario do you see? Professor Chomsky.
Well, I think the crucial word that you mentioned was citizenry. That underlies all of the options that you mentioned. Electoral, third parties, lobbying, demonstrations, activism, and it can have an effect. It's happened over time. A lot of things wrong with the country. We agree on all of that, but there has been progress over the years. In some ways, it's a more civilized country than it was, say, 50 years ago. Actually, in many respects, like women's rights, gay rights, even opposition to aggression. The public activism did manage to, there's pretty good reason to believe that the mass demonstrations in 1969 about the Indochina War may have actually averted a nuclear attack. It's not certain, but there's evidence to that effect. They certainly did lead to a retrenchment. What happened after that was horrible enough, but it could have been a lot worse. But let's move on a couple of years. In the early 1980s, when Reagan came in, his administration tried to follow almost exactly the playbook of the Kennedy administration in the early 1960s when they escalated the war in Vietnam, almost point by point. But there was a big difference. When Kennedy did it, there was no reaction, and they went on to build up a huge war. When the Reagan administration started, there was immediately a major public reaction and protests all over the place, popular groups, church groups, activist groups, and they backed off. In fact, within a couple of weeks, exposures started to appear in the mainstream press, Wall Street Journal, of the falsehoods in the white papers that they'd produced, and they backed off. What happened they were trying to launch a major war in Central America. Well, what actually happened was awful enough, but it wasn't as bad as what happened in Indochina in the 1960s than it could have been. Let's go on to the Iraq War. A lot of people believe, I think falsely, that the protests had no impact. I don't agree with that.